friends and family. Welcome to Sasquatch Sisters Northwest YouTube channel. My name is Angelique and I will be your host tonight around the campfire, and I think we are going to have a lot of fun tonight. This is the first episode in a three-part series that we're going to do about the Spirit Lake, Idaho area. And also, if you happen to hear any background noises, well, that is because I am doggy sitting my son and daughter-in-law's two fur babies, Finnegan and Murdoch. And they are two Australian shepherds, and their little toenails are just click, click, click on the floor. So if you happen to hear anything, it's just them walking around saying hi. So grab yourself a roasting stick, a cold beverage, find yourself a comfy spot around the fire because we are getting ready to start. And make sure you hit that notification bell so you'll know when part 2 and 3 come out. All right, let's go. So let me set the scene for you about Spirit Lake, Idaho. Spirit Lake, Idaho is about 45 minutes north of Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, and it sits between Sandpoint, Idaho, and Spokane, Washington. It was a very small little community that was built in 1903, and just specifically for logging. And it was in 1910 that Frederick Blackwell built the Panhandle Lumber Mill and set it at the north end of the lake, which is where the boat marina is now. And he also brought in the railroad so that there were people coming in, not only for lumber going in and out of the mill, but also for people that could come into the town of Spirit Lake by train. And this was also considered to be a place that was Spokane's go-to point for recreation for the upper echelon and elite. So Spirit Lake has many cabins and buildings and houses along the shores of the lake that have been built by the very wealthy, prominent people of the area. And still, even today, there are many beautiful homes that are along the shores, many of which you can't even see from the road. You have to actually drive in by boat on a few of them. Well, in 1939, there was a horrific forest fire that took out the lumber mill and the rail yard. So it really removed from Spirit Lake their ability to be able to employ the thousands of people that lived there, because at that point in time, Spirit Lake was actually almost as big as the city of Coeur d'Alene. It had thousands of people living there. But when that forest fire took out the main mill, it removed everyone's ability to be able to work. So most of the residents uprooted and moved out of the area and left just a scant few. In fact, I think there was only 600 people at that point in time that actually remained in the city of Spirit Lake. Now, one of the buildings that survived that fire was the hotel that Frederick Blackwell had built for the people that were coming off of the train. And it still sits on Main Street of Spirit Lake today and is still being used. And it is the longest continuously running hotel and saloon in the state of Idaho. It has never closed its doors, and it's been the longest running liquor license in the state of Idaho. So it is still a thriving little saloon, and it has its ghosts, and along with that saloon and hotel, right next door to it is the Linger Longer Lounge. And then if you walk a few paces down, then you'll come across a little cafe, go a little bit, a few more doors down, you're going to see Joe's Hole, which is also a watering hole. And then a few doors down from that, you're going to see the Old West hardware store. And these are all buildings that were built in 1907 that survived that fire, and to this day are still being used every day as businesses. And it gives it that Old West feel that makes the town of Spirit Lake so quaint and so Mayberry. And I can tell you today, you can walk into any one of those 3 watering holes on Main Street and still see the same old timers sitting there that have come in every single day to visit their favorite bartender for the past 30 years. They still come in every day and have their beer, and everybody knows them by first name. And that is the way that Spirit Lake is. Now, for the upper echelon that come in during the summer, many of those people uproot and leave for the winter. And so the town's population increases in the summer, and it's bustling and loud, and there's music and street parties and things like the Big Back-In, which is the lawnmower races that go on every year for Father's Day, which thousands of people come to see. And it's also a stop-off point for many of the biker runs whenever they do say a veterans run or something. Most of the bikers in the area and their groups will stop in and they'll do their poker runs along the main street in Spirit Lake. And then in the winter time, when all the kids go back to school again, then the town and the sidewalk just kind of rolls up the streets, and just a few of the regulars stay. The businesses remain open, but it just drops in population to just the locals. And that's what gives it that feeling of walking down the street and knowing everybody that you see by first name. It really is a beautiful town, and it's the trees and the mountains that surround it in the Hoodoo Valley are just absolutely beautiful. But the main attraction is Spirit Lake, and Spirit Lake is where we begin our story. Now, the legend about Spirit Lake began before there was actually a town and before there were fur traders. It began with the natives that lived there, and that was the Kootenai tribe that had settled in on the shores of Spirit Lake. Now, the legend is that there was a chief who had a beautiful daughter that was sought after by a more hostile tribe that lived across the lake from them. Well, the chief of the other tribe wanted that daughter to be his bride. And she didn't want to marry him because she was in love with one of the warriors in her tribe, and she was betrothed to marry him. However, the warring chief threatened that he would basically annihilate their tribe if the chief would not allow him to marry his daughter. So they consented for her to marry him. Well, she was absolutely distraught, and so was her lover. And so they climbed to the top of what is now known as Suicide Cliff, and they joined wrists together in ceremonial marriage, and then they jumped off and committed suicide. Well, according to the legend, their bodies have never been found, and so they say that on moonlit nights or when there's a mist across the water, you can sometimes either see them gliding across the water, or you can hear them crying and wailing in grief over their loss of not being able to marry each other. Now, there's also a legend that there was a canoe full of warriors that was crossing the lake, and a water entity tipped the canoe over, and the warriors were all drowned. And they say that sometimes in the early mornings, you can actually catch glimpses of a spirit canoe gliding across the water. So Spirit Lake has its legends, and it has its spirits, and it has its mysteries. And one of them is the sounds that people hear either in the middle of the night or the very early morning that come off of the water. Now, usually after the tourists and everybody have gone to bed and the houses have shut their lights off and the noise and the music is stopped and the boats have all been moored, it becomes very, very quiet. And so that's where we're going to begin. Now, before I tell you about this experience, I need to warn you ahead of time that tonight's episode is an adult episode. If you have any little ears around, you might want to turn on something else, because there's going to be some adult language. And I'm not going to edit that out, because if you knew the gentleman that I'm telling you this experience came from, if I edited it out, it wouldn't be authentic. And I think in this circumstance, it needs to be authentic. It needs to come from his words and the way that he saw it. And so if that offends you, then I need to let you know that tonight's episode is not the one for you. Next week will be different, but tonight I need for you to know that ahead of time. So, with that being said, this experience comes from a gentleman and his daughter who've lived in the town of Spirit Lake for many years, and he's raised his family there. His name is Tony, and he is a no-nonsense kind of guy who isn't afraid to set the record straight, and he isn't known to spin any tall tales or embellish anything either. He's unapologetic and not worried about any negative opinions of his experience. He tells it like it is. He's direct, and there are no doubts that what he is sharing with us tonight is something he will never forget. Tony's daughter, Autumn, contacted us and suggested that we talk to her dad about his experiences. Now, I agreed to do so, so he and I met at the little pavilion on the beach at Spirit Lake, where I interviewed him. After I met up with him, then Autumn had shared with me her own experiences, and then it kind of went from there to another woman's experience at Spirit Lake, and then the very last one that took place just less than 2 weeks ago with my own experience. So this one is definitely something that hits home for me, and I'm really excited to share this with you. Now, I asked his permission to record him, and I asked him if it would be okay with me telling his story on the air, and he agreed. I'm not going to play the recording of him because it wouldn't make sense unless I was able to fill in some gaps that you would have to be a resident of Spirit Lake to be able to understand. So having said that, he said he was okay with me telling his name, and he was fine with whatever it was that I was going to go ahead and read on the air. So this is what he experienced. Now, before we begin, I want you to know that Tony's first experience did not happen in the inland Northwest. But it was his first experience that he had that made him realize what he did encounter later on here in North Idaho. When he was a young teenager of approximately 14 or 15 years old, he lived in the Puget Sound area with his family. He and his dad and his mom were salmon fishing in Horsehead Bay. Now, I'm not familiar with that area myself, but from what I understood from Tony, it was the closest bay toward the Olympic Mountains and the farthest bay from civilization. At least that's kind of the gist of what I got from what Tony had to say. And this is what he said. It was late in the evening. My dad, mom, and me, we were starting to head back from fishing. We heard this scream coming out of the woods. It wasn't real close to the shore. It seems like it was up on the ridge line, and I think that's how they travel, because the ones I've heard around here were on these ridge lines. Now, as he told me this, he was pointing up to the hilltops that surround Spirit Lake. And he said, but yeah, that was the first time that I heard it. And I didn't know what it was, but my dad said it was a Bigfoot. It stood the hair up on the back of your neck. It didn't sound like anything else that I know of. A wounded cougar or elk or anything like that. Nah, not even close. And I'd been hunting for quite a while by then. Now, Tony and I paused for a few minutes to go over all of the wildlife in the Pacific Northwest that can make a scream that would be scary, and he was familiar with all of them as well as I am, since he had spent most of his life outdoors in the woods, either hunting, fishing, logging. We spent a few minutes naming the usual nighttime noises that can be heard frequently in this area, such as screech owls, bobcats, coyotes, and even some of the domestic ones like peacocks and guinea hens. He had heard them all, and he was pretty resolute that what he had heard was not any of them. Now, I'm going to pause for just a second here and explain a couple things ahead of time for you listeners so that you can understand a little bit more about what Tony is getting ready to share with us. Tony was married for many years to a woman by the name of Colleen, and he and his wife owned a houseboat that they kept anchored against the shores of Spirit Lake throughout the summers. They were very well known in the community, and the houseboat was utilized constantly during the summer. Now, he and his wife loved each other very much, but they had opposing sleep schedules, and they found it difficult to stay on the same schedule with each other. Colleen was more of a night owl, and she liked to stay up very late, and he was an early bird who had to get up sometimes before daybreak to go to work. They spent as much time as they could with each other around those schedules, but when it came time for them to go to sleep, Tony would usually leave the boat and drive just a mere half-mile at most from the marina up to the house in town where he could sleep in his own bed, and she could stay up as late as she wanted without disturbing him. She absolutely loved the serenity of being able to stay moored down at the marina when it was quiet, and she spent her summer nights out in the water with the guard dog as her companion. Well, Tony was only a few minutes away if she needed him, and it was an agreement between the two of them that they were both satisfied with. Now, a little bit about Colleen. She was a capable, headstrong woman who didn't fear much. She had spent most of her life raising and training horses. She was beautiful and very stubborn. And once she made up her mind to something, she was unyielding. So when it came to the fact that she wanted to be left alone on the water, he didn't even try to talk her out of sleeping on the boat. She liked it that way, and that was where she spent most of her summers. Then their teenage daughter, Autumn, would go back and forth to sleeping either at the house where her father was at, or she would go and stay with her mom on the boat. It made the summers perfect for the entire family, and they were all comfortable with the arrangement. Now let's go back to what Tony had to say about his next experience with the forest people. The second time I heard the Bigfoot was here at the lake. We were on our houseboat, me and my wife, Colleen, and we were right over here off the beach. Now, he paused for a second to point over his shoulder to the shoreline near the boat docks where they like to anchor off for the nights. And it was about 12 o'clock at night. The lake was empty of any other boaters besides Colleen, and most of the inhabitants and the houses along its shoreline had turned off their lights, and it was quiet and the waters were still. Tony had gotten up. He was tired, but he was restless and he couldn't sleep. And he knew that he had to get up early to go to work the next morning. So he decided he'd only be able to sleep if it was in his bed at home. And it was past the time of the night when they usually parted ways. So he gathered his things to get ready to head home. Colleen had actually already fallen asleep, and so Tony just tiptoed off the boat quietly so he wouldn't disturb her, the same way he had done it many, many, many times before in the past. And this is what Tony had to say about that night. So I get out of the boat and I'm standing there smoking a cigarette, and I'm checking the line to make sure she wasn't going to float away. And then over on, I'd say, Rathdrum Mountain. He pointed off in the distance to a mountaintop about 23 miles south of Spirit Lake. I heard it scream. It was quite a ways away, but it was still loud enough that he could hear it clearly. And Tony said, I was like, wow, I've heard that before. Tony looked off towards the mountain as he told me this. That's gotta be a Bigfoot, he said. It was loud, but it was far enough in the distance that I could tell it was far away. So I stood there for a few minutes, and then all of a sudden, right over there, I'd say just this hillside closer than Spokane Mountain. Well, he pointed to a hillside about 15 miles from Spirit Lake. Then another one yelled, and I was like, holy crap, they're communicating. So I yell into the boat, Colleen, you gotta get up, you gotta hear this. Well, she just kind of rolled over and says, what? And I says, I think I just heard a Bigfoot, actually 2 of them. Well, Colleen didn't believe him and just rolled over and went back to sleep. Well, Tony said, then it wasn't even a minute after I was talking to her, right over here, another one, like right in here. And he pointed to a ridge top even closer. It had to have been up on the ridge line. Well, I figured if it was down in the valley, sound doesn't travel that far. It gets muffled. But the sound was going off everywhere, and I was like, holy shit. Well, Tony admitted that the noises were unsettling, to say the least, and he didn't like leaving her there that night, but after assessing the situation, Tony felt that she'd be safe on the boat, since the noises were coming from the ridge tops miles away and not nearby. He was tired and he had to get up early the next morning, and since their teenage daughter had called and said she was coming down there to stay the night with her mom on the boat, he was content in knowing that they could stay there safely. Well, he told her he had to get home and get to bed so he could get up early for work, and she said okay, she'd be fine. She had the guard dog with her, and Autumn was on her way down to the marina. Well, Tony shrugged when he was telling me this, and he said, I told her, okay, Colleen, I'm going back to the house. Tony said, I started walking up the beach, and I get almost to the boat launch here, and I could hear one over on Hoodoo Mountain, which is about 15 miles from the lake. So there was 4 of them, and they were communicating back and forth to each other. I've never heard anything like it before. It was like they were telling each other, this is where I'm at, I'm over here, and I was like, oh, this is creepy. But still, it was far enough away, there was no reason to think that Colleen would have any problems. And I asked him if she had heard the noises herself, and he said no, she couldn't hear anything from inside the boat. And she really wasn't interested in it anyway. To her, the belief in Bigfoot was just nonsense. She was locked inside the boat and groggy and trying to go back to sleep, and Tony admitted the screams made his hair stand on end, but he knew she wouldn't budge. So he went ahead, and after checking on the position of the boat and the mooring lines, he went ahead and left. And he said, so I get all the way to the house, which is only a few blocks away from the marina, and I didn't hear another one, of course. I had jumped in my pickup and went to the house and probably had the radio on. But anyway, so I wasn't there 5 minutes, and she calls me on the phone and says, get your ass down here and come get us. There's one right behind the boat. And he pointed and said, like right back up in here. And Tony turned and pointed to a spot on the hillside within 100 yards or so of the beach. Now, at this point, I'm freaking out because, I heard the first 4 and now she's got another one. So I grab my shotgun and I jump in the truck and come back down here, and I'm skirting the edge of the beach. And the girls said it was right there at the edge, and we were anchored quite a ways down the beach. So I was like, oh crap. So I got my shotgun, pointed at the tree line, and they come out of the boat and I say, let's get the hell out of here. Then he kept the rifle firmly to his cheek while he walked the girls back to his pickup and loaded them up and left quickly. Needless to say, they did not come back the rest of the night to the boat. Now, Autumn told me what she had witnessed is she said that she had gone down to the marina to stay the night with her mom on the boat. It was late, but when she got there, it wasn't long before she too heard the noises coming from the ridge tops around the lake. And she said, I heard the noises too. It was like nothing I've ever heard before. And she told me that was when Mom called Dad and told him to come get us. I can't tell you where it was because it's really hard to tell. It was just there, and we didn't want to stay on the boat. This was the night that made the entire family firm believers in the existence of these forest people. Sadly, just a few years after this happened, Colleen passed away, and our hearts go out to Tony and Autumn for their loss. There will always be a bit of an empty spot on that shoreline where she liked to moor the houseboat. And I'm sure that the people of Spirit Lake who were used to seeing her each summer probably still look for her there. I know I do. But for those of us who are left behind, we have to move on with our lives and live the way that we know we're supposed to. And I know that Colleen would have wanted Tony to do so. And that is why a few years after she passed, Tony began dating someone else. And she is a very good person and they have a great relationship. And we're very happy that he's been able to move on with his life. And it is through her that he had another encounter. Well, actually, I shouldn't say that he had an encounter, but what he did have happen was something that definitely has stuck in his mind as being, again, confirmation that these beings do exist. And this is what Tony said about that. We were between Carywood and Bayview. We were on the Bayview Cutoff Road. She has about 15-acre parcel out there with a house on it. And I was cleaning up deadfall and firewood, and I came across an old skidder road that had mud on the ground. Well, Tony began patting his shirt pockets and looking around. I wish I had brought my phone because I did take a picture of it. I found a footprint. It had been rained on, so it was kind of hard to tell, but it was about that much bigger than my foot. And as he said this, he motioned approximately 5 to 6 inches past his own size 12 boot. It had 5 toes, and the big toe was bigger than the rest of them, but the little toe was kind of spread out. The rest of the toes were all close, but the little one was kind of spread out. And I thought, well, that might be a Bigfoot track. So I took a picture of it. I kept cleaning up and I was going down the skidder trail and I came to a little peckerpole tree about yay big. Well, let me explain to you. Peckerpole is a common name for what the loggers in the inland Northwest call a lodgepole. It's a very thin version of a pine tree that in the inland Northwest is one of the few trees that grow on old burns. So usually they don't get to be very big around, but they can grow really dense and close to each other, much like the fur on a dog. And they're commonly used for lodge poles, for teepees, and for small structures. But the loggers commonly refer to them as pecker poles. Well, Tony held his hands apart to show the size of the tree, and he said, yeah, just a little pecker pole about yay big. Well, he held his hand about 5 inches apart to show the size of it. And he said, yeah, it was up a little hill. And then he demonstrated with his foot how high. You know, where the skidder had come through and had pushed everything down like an embankment. Well, here's this little pecker pole, and I noticed about 8 feet up it was snapped off. Well, we hadn't had any winds or anything to cause that, and it was a fresh break. Well, I've done enough logging to know a fresh break when I see one. And I was like, well, that's weird. And I looked down, and right on top of that little embankment was 4 toes. And part of it was crushed down like it had stepped on it. But that was the only other track. I didn't see all 5 toes, but I could see 4 of them, and you could tell that there was 5. It just hung over the edge of the embankment. And I know what I seen. It wasn't a deer or a bear print or anything like that. And he patted his shirt pocket again. I just wish I had have thought to bring my phone so I could have shown you. And I asked him, do you know if the top of the tree was pointed in the direction of anything of interest, like, say, a water source? And he said, no, but it was pointed towards the other footprint that I found, and it was right in line with it. Well, I asked him if he followed it, and he said I didn't follow it, and I didn't go back in there and look around, but I could tell that nothing else in the area had been snapped off. And there was a lot of these little pecker poles around there, and I figure, well, no tree had fallen over to break it, and nothing else is snapped, and we didn't have any wind, so this is kind of weird. I do have a picture of it, and it was on her property. Well, I asked him if she had had any encounters with them while living there, and he said no, she doesn't have any stories. Then he paused for a minute and said, I wear a size 12, and that footprint was about 5 inches bigger, and it was in the center of where there was a mud strip, and that was the only print. Apparently, it must have walked across, stepped in the center, and then kept going. And he paused and said, I was standing around it, and my own impression was only about that deep. And he motioned to about an inch deep with his hand. But that track was about like this, and he motioned to about 5 to 6 inches deep. Well, he shrugged and said, but in fairness, it could have been softer ground after the rain, too. But no one else had been back in there, and once you see one, you just know. So quickly, what I would like to do is explain a little bit about forest management to you listeners, so that I think you'll understand a little bit easier about why that one tree that Tony saw stuck out to him as much as it did, and why it was something that he made a mental note of. So, using my own experience, I have either worked in the woods myself, or I've been with other people in the woods, as either through logging or through reforestation, which I was hired to do, which included not just planting trees, but also cutting slash, which is getting rid of the ground foliage that choked out young trees so that they couldn't grow. So after years and years of being up in the woods every day and learning about forest management, there are many things that as a logger you learn, and it becomes second nature to you. That is determining and understanding and looking at every single tree to find out whether or not it's diseased, if it's got bugs in it or some kind of an insect that's going to kill it. You've got to decide whether or not it's got a flaw to it, like mistletoe, where it would get a big old knot of different branches that make it not worth anything, whether or not it gets punky and rotten in the middle. These are all things that you have to determine. And so you literally have to stop and look at every tree. Now, as you're out in the woods, certain storms are going to come through, wind, you're going to have snows that are going to come, you're going to have heavy rains that are going to make the forest floor super soft, and some trees are going to fall over really easy, like bull pine. Bull pine have a really, really shallow root system, so when they tip over, the roots are just, they're more like a surface root rather than going deep within the soil. You notice these things as they occur naturally in the wilderness, but every once in a while you'll see something and you'll know that it's not right, that it shouldn't have happened. And I'm going to use this reference so that I think it'll make a little bit more sense to you. Okay, think about the forest as an enormous garden. And each day you go out there and you weed the ones that are going to choke out the food and the stuff that you want to grow tall and healthy. And maybe off to the side you planted a stand of some corn stalks. And as you're working each day and you're watering and you're weeding and you're trimming and you're planting, those corn stalks are getting taller and taller and straighter and healthy, and they're right there. You see them every day and they're a part of your life. And then one morning you get up and you go to weed your garden, and suddenly there's a swath that has been made through the cornfield that has toppled over and broken a bunch of stalk. You're immediately going to notice them because that should not have happened. So it's the same kind of a thing when you're working in the woods. You'll know and you'll recognize when there's a windstorm what the trees look like when they've fallen over. After a heavy snow, you'll recognize and you'll watch and you'll see how the trees start slowly bending with the load of the snow and the ice build up on one side until pretty soon they break and they snap and they fall. And that becomes your everyday life. You recognize it and you understand it. Then one day you come out, and on a perfectly normal day, when there is no windfall, when there is no snow load, when there is no heavy rains to loosen up the soil, and you see a perfectly healthy tree that has no bug kill, has no disease, and it's snapped off without there being any reason for it. That's when you step back and realize, okay, that is an anomaly. And that's what happened with Tony. The reason why I talked about forest management was because I wanted you to really consider the education that this man has and how well he pays close attention to the health of trees. Tony is very knowledgeable in logging and in forest management, and so when he spotted this one tree that was broken and he had to step back and really take a look at it, it was because he knew from his many years of working up in the woods that that one tree did not happen naturally. So that's what I wanted to bring to your attention. And I am actually going to end this here at this point because our next episode is going to be something that his daughter is going to discuss and what happened with her and her best friend. And that ties in with what happened with Tony. So we're going to end this episode here. We're going to grab another beverage and throw another log on the fire, and make sure you hit that notification bell so when episode 2 comes out, you will be the first to know. Have a good night.